Not evil. He's not a medical professional.
They never mentioned that he's mental ill and that's why he did it.
Nothing mad about it. It was absolutely evil incarnate.
Leeds, November 1980. The body of a woman is found on a piece of waste ground in the city's student area. Her name is Jacqueline Hill, and she's the 13th woman in 5 years to die at the hands of the Ripper. Like most of the others, she'd been struck over the head with a hammer before being killed. Detective Constable Alan Foster was one of the first police officers on the scene.
This is where we found Jacqueline Hill, on the grass down here. She was the 13th murder victim by the so-called Yorkshire Ripper, as we knew him then. And we just wondered how long we were going to go on at that stage before we finish up arresting him.
It's a question the whole country was asking. The killings, which began in red light areas in West Yorkshire and Manchester, had started in 1975. As time passed, the Ripper widened his deadly reach into new territories, and the North became racked by fear, as David Yallop, a journalist and author of a book on the murders, discovered.
He spread terror like few men within my lifetime of investigating appalling things in many countries have been capable of doing. I mean, I saw photographs of these women, dreadful, dreadful things that he had done. And I have had, from time to time, nightmares ever since.
Many of the victims were prostitutes, but as time went on, the number of exceptions grew, such as Jane MacDonald, a 16-year-old shop assistant.
When it happens like it did, mutilation and everything, I went to identify her, and I just collapsed there and then.
Never before or since has a serial killer paralysed whole communities like this for so many years.
This man will continue to kill until he's caught. No woman is safe whilst he's at large.
It was so frustrating that ladies were still being murdered, and we just couldn't get anywhere with it, basically. Most families in Leeds had got a relative that had been checked out, a male relative. One of my brothers was checked out.
When the breakthrough came, it was down to sheer good luck. January 1981, police in Sheffield arrest a man sitting in a car with a prostitute.
He was driving an old car with number plates which were inconsistent with it, which were stolen.
Before going down to the police station, the man, who was called Peter Sutcliffe, asked for permission to go and urinate. One of the officers was suspicious and later returned to the arrest site.
He remembers about when Sutcliffe went off for a pee in the wood, and he goes to roughly that area and he finds a hammer. And they confront Sutcliffe with that on the Sunday of January the 4th. And Sutcliffe says, I think I know what you're leading up to. And the copper says, well, what are we leading up to? He says, well, the Yorkshire Ripper. He said, what about him? He said, it's me.
5 years of terror were over. The Yorkshire Ripper had been caught.
I can tell you that we are absolutely delighted with developments at this stage. Absolutely delighted.
Police celebrated. It seemed to be an open and shut case. But no one yet realised a decades-long debate on the Ripper's sanity was about to begin. Was he mentally ill, or was he playing games with police? Sutcliffe's brother Carl has lived under the shadow of the Ripper for 26 years. He was astonished his mild-mannered brother was the killer.
I was shocked, just numb really. I was expecting him to say to me when I got there that, oh no, it's not me, it's all a mistake. And when he just admitted it and said, look, it was me, he was chatting away as if he was sat in a pub. Couldn't believe it was our Peter, who was sort of a real nice, gentle sort of a guy.
Sutcliffe kept up his casual behaviour to the police. He confessed to an appalling catalogue of crimes, 7 attempted murders and 13 killings. Some involved mutilation and horrific sexual degradation, yet still Sutcliffe maintained his apparent nonchalance.
It was a short person with a very high-pitched, squeaky voice. And for some reason, I don't know what a murderer's supposed to look like, but it didn't look like one.
Sutcliffe lived in Bradford with his wife, Sonia. Alan Foster was one of the officers sent to search the couple's house, still hung with Christmas decorations.
I took him into the kitchen and asked him, where the knives were. And he actually pointed to 2 knives that he'd used. Sonia Sutcliffe was stood at the side of him. She said, "Oh, Peter, while you're there, do you want some Christmas cake? Because otherwise it's going to go to waste." And so she actually gave him some Christmas cake. We just couldn't believe it. And he was stood eating Christmas cake in the kitchen.
Then after several weeks in custody, Sutcliffe revealed what he said was his real motive. And it immediately raised questions about his sanity, as the police told David Yallop.
We've got another potential suspect, David. I said, he said, God. Sutcliffe's position with why he killed these women simply was God told him to go out and eliminate all prostitutes.
Sutcliffe said he had been hearing voices from God since the mid-60s. They'd started when he was working as a gravedigger and later began ordering him to kill prostitutes. But there was one piece of evidence that could have presented a much more disturbing portrait of a cold-blooded killer.
The way the leggings that he'd made, it was obvious that he was pleasuring himself at the murder scenes. That's the impression that we've got.
But when the Yorkshire Rippers trial began in May 1981, this evidence wasn't shown to the jury, and it would remain hidden for another 22 years. On January the 4th, 1981, the Yorkshire Rippers' 5-year reign of terror was ended. Caught almost by accident by 2 uniformed police officers in Sheffield.
Just straightforward coppering.
His story of God telling him to kill prostitutes meant that Sutcliffe's sanity was now the key question. Was he, in fact, the victim of a serious mental illness?
But he was just the nicest, kindest, gentlest, quietest guy you could ever meet. For him to turn out to be this mass murderer, the Yorkshire Ripper, is just beyond any comprehension. It's like being Jekyll and Hyde.
The psychiatrists knew what they thought. They said he was a paranoid schizophrenic. Professor Nigel Eastman has worked with the criminally insane for almost 30 years.
Schizophrenia is an illness that can present in a number of ways, but the core of it is that the person loses touch with reality, and almost invariably the person experiences hallucinations, such as hearing voices when there's nobody speaking. And that can include invasion by God, if you like.
As the trial approached, both prosecution and defence medical experts accepted Sutcliffe's story that the voices from God had made him kill. They advised the court Sutcliffe was not a cold-blooded murderer and should not be tried as such.
Both of them were unanimous, ultimately, in saying that the only appropriate verdict in medical terms was one of manslaughter based upon a diagnosis called by lawyers diminished responsibility. Sutcliffe professed at all times that he was really the hopeless creature of God.
The Attorney General, Michael Havers, who led the prosecution team, didn't dispute the psychiatric evidence when Sutcliffe's trial began.
Havers' position was that he accepted Sutcliffe would plead guilty to the crimes, but diminished responsibility, so you reduce it from murder to manslaughter, with everybody agreeing of the end product, and the judge wasn't having it.
It's almost unheard of for judges to go against medical evidence like this. But Justice Boreham was notoriously independent. He did not want the case to be seen as a cosy deal between the lawyers.
He said, "I think this is a matter classically for a jury to decide, and I'm not comfortable about this being disposed of in this way, Mr. Attorney."
I've never felt more like cheering for a judge. It made sure that justice in the old cliché was going to be seen to be done.
The ruling by the judge meant the jury would decide whether Peter Sutcliffe was mad or bad. May the 5th, 1981, and crowds had queued overnight for a seat in the public gallery for what was dubbed the trial of the century.
And then at exactly 9:36, the wail of police sirens heralded the arrival of the man who has become known simply as the Ripper.
The atmosphere, to use that well-recited platitude, was electric.
As much press as I can remember at the coronation of the Queen, as much press as that. I was offered £1,000 for my press ticket as I went in from an American, and when I said no, he obviously thought I wanted to barter, and he was shouting after me, 2,000, 3,000. It was like being in Sotheby's at one point.
Prosecuting counsel Harry Ognall believed there was a sexual motive for the crimes and set out to destroy the credibility of the medical experts, especially Dr. Hugo Milne, the defence psychiatrist.
What the jury have to decide here, I suggested to him, is whether this man was acting under the sole promptings of a delusion that he had a divine mission to kill, or that is a completely erroneous diagnosis. And if it is, Dr. Milne, a completely erroneous diagnosis, then the only alternative verdict open to them is one of guilty of murder. And with that proposition, Dr. Milne agreed.
Milne accepted Sutcliffe's account of voices from God causing him to kill. Like all the psychiatrists, he denied that sex was the primary motive for the crimes.
The psychiatrist's evidence is entirely derived from Sutcliffe. They had not put Sutcliffe's contestants, that he was actually on a message from God, against the framework of the real forensic evidence of all of these appalling crimes.
And police already had evidence that some believe destroyed Sutcliffe's account of a holy mission. When arrested, he was wearing a homemade pair of leggings under his trousers. They had padded knees and were open at the front, exposing his genitals.
Obviously, the way the leggings that he'd made, it was obvious that he was pleasuring himself at the murder scenes when he was attacking the victims. That's the impression that we've got. And he was arrested with his underpants in his pocket.
But detectives, who were exhausted after a marathon confession from Sutcliffe, failed to realise how crucial this evidence might be, and the prosecuting barristers weren't told about them.
Why it was never drawn to our attention, I do not begin to know. Had the garment been produced in evidence, then the telling nature of it as demonstrating a sexually engendered motive was enormous.
Despite this error, Harry Ognall did have plenty of ammunition to try and disprove Sutcliffe's stories. Prison officers had overheard Sutcliffe telling his wife by faking illness he could get a reduced sentence. And there were the crimes themselves. Vicious attacks with sharpened screwdrivers or knives involving stabbing and mutilation of victims. He even had sex with one victim as she lay dying.
Apart from causing their deaths by violent blows to the head with a hammer, if you look at what he'd done other than that, by way of gratuitous violence to other parts of their bodies, the suggestion that a man had some kind of holy mission simply didn't bear, to my mind, analysis.
And crucially, many of Sutcliffe's victims weren't prostitutes, like Marguerite Walls, a civil servant, Barbara Leach, a university student, and Jacqueline Hill, also a student. The most compelling exchanges of the trial came when Sutcliffe went into the witness box to face questions from the Attorney General.
In the questions he put to Sutcliffe, he would receive over and over again this sort of reply: "Fine words, Mr. Attorney, but well wide of the mark." Or, "Well, I've listened to that with care, but I don't agree with it," elevating it to the status of a dialogue, if you like, between equals. I think he went into the witness box because it was his last chance to strut a stage invested with the huge notoriety of the forensic spotlights on him, and he enjoyed it.
After 3 weeks of the trial dominating the headlines, the jury retired. They were back within 7 hours.
When the foreman said, "We find him guilty," My junior behind, bless his memory, John Hitchin, now long dead, said in an almost audible voice, "Bingo." And that's exactly how I felt.
The jury had decided the psychiatrists were wrong and that Peter Sutcliffe was bad and not mad. He was given 20 life sentences with the recommendation that he should serve a minimum of 30 years.
He remained the same enigmatic figure after being sentenced by Leslie Boreham as he had when he'd first walked up the steps some days before.
He just turned and looked at his wife and was gone.
Sutcliffe now faced a long stretch in Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, one of Britain's toughest prisons. There was little sympathy for him, even from his own family.
I was very angry with him at the time, very angry. I just couldn't understand why he could do such things and left a lot of children without mums, and he's burdened us with his crimes. Strangers would whisper, "Oh, there goes the Yorkshire Ripper's brother," or I can even lip read, "There's the Yorkshire Ripper's brother at 100 yards now." I'm not used to people saying it.
As Sutcliffe settled into Parkhurst, the debate about his sanity refused to die. Psychiatrists continued to say he was schizophrenic, but the jury had decided he was faking his illness and playing games with the truth. Games that many believe have continued to this day. Firstly, there were fears that he hadn't made a full confession.
We had a fresh look at all these outstanding crimes throughout the country, and we figured that he could be responsible for another 47 murders or attempt murders or rapes. And all these people that have suffered deaths in their family and attacks in their family should have the right to know whether Peter Sutcliffe has been responsible for those attacks. They have a right to know.
But Alan Foster was denied permission to interview Sutcliffe and told to destroy much of the remaining evidence. Despite suspicions about scores of unsolved crimes, it seemed the police had closed the book on the Yorkshire Ripper. But with Sutcliffe behind bars, at least one woman felt she could shed more light on the game he was playing. She knew he'd lied to the police about the extent of his crimes. Her name was Tracy Brown.
From 1977, I knew that I'd been attacked by the Ripper. I said, I just know it. You know, there's no two ways about it, just like a very strong instinct.
West Yorkshire, August 1975, pre-Ripper days. At Silsden, high in the Pennines, 14-year-old Tracy Brown separates from her sister after a party.
I just happened to sit down and take my shoes off because my feet were hurting me at the time. And then I just happened to look up and I saw this guy with this dark hair and a beard just standing there looking at me. Only for a couple of seconds, he followed on up the road and I thought, oh, I better start walking home. And so that's what I did, and I fell into step with this guy. It was just small talk, really. He asked me if I had a boyfriend, asked me my name, asked if I lived in Silsden. Definitely a Yorkshire accent, but very gentle, high-pitched. I just remember I went to turn around to thank him, you know, for his company. And I never actually got to turn around before he was hitting me. Just thought it was some sort of stick at the time. I didn't know it was a hammer. I just knew it was really, really heavy and blunt. And he hit me about 5 times. And after he did that, this car came down and disturbed him, and then he picked me up and then threw me over the fence. And then I heard him running off. That's like it happened yesterday. I can hear him running off now.
Tracy was lucky to survive. Yet despite needing emergency brain surgery, she remembered enough to help police produce a photo fit of her attacker.
I didn't think it was perfect, but it was very much of a likeness because there's not that many people that, you know, look like that.
Tracy's attacker evaded capture. Then as the Yorkshire Ripper began his terrible campaign, she noticed the photo fit of her assailant matched those produced by other Ripper victims and witnesses. She told police they weren't convinced.
It was very frustrating, yeah. And the amount of times that, you know, I've talked to the police through clenched teeth thinking, well, take it seriously, will you?
She wasn't taken seriously because the head of the Ripper squad, Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, was looking for a Geordie.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me.
In 1978, he received the first in a series of hoax tapes and letters. He wrongly believed they contained information only the killer could know. This must be the voice of the Ripper.
I reckon your boys are letting you down, George.
Tracy had been attacked by a Yorkshireman, so detectives said she couldn't be a Ripper victim. The police continued to believe the killer was from the northeast right up until Sutcliffe's capture.
I just thought, put it behind me and just move on. I just wish they would have, taken my case more seriously so all these other girls could have been here today.
What Tracy Brown didn't know was West Yorkshire police were looking at Sutcliffe's crimes again. But it was a secret inquiry led by a senior officer, Assistant Chief Constable Keith Hellawell. It meant a chance for the Ripper to resume his subtle games with police.
There were in all about 60 murders and attempted murders that were put on the list for us to investigate. I refined that list to 10 probables, and these were the ones that I interviewed him about over a period of time.
In 1981, Hellawell visited the Ripper for the first time. The psychiatrist still believed Sutcliffe was schizophrenic, but their patient still disagreed.
His first words to me were that I'm not going to speak to you or any police officers because you've let me down. I'm not a monster. I was doing God's will. Clearly, the criminal justice system doesn't believe me, so that's why I'm here. But I've told the police everything. I'm not going to tell you anything more.
Sutcliffe had relished his clashes with the Attorney General in court. Now he had a new sport, a senior police officer to spar with.
He was enjoying the visits. He was enjoying the challenge that I know something you don't know. You wanted me to tell you, and I'm not going to tell you.
But Peter Sutcliffe wasn't just playing games with Keith Hellawell. He was also toying with the emotions of vulnerable women.
It was a very passionate, very intimate relationship, and we did fall in love with one another.
By January 1983, Peter Sutcliffe had been in prison for 18 months, having been convicted of murdering 13 women. A jury had ruled him sane, but psychiatrists never accepted this verdict. They still diagnosed him as schizophrenic. Unable to move him to a psychiatric hospital, they kept him in the prison hospital wing to keep him safe from others and himself. The plan failed.
Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, arrived at Newport Crown Court amid scenes of strictest security. He came to give evidence in the case against James Costello, who, it's claimed, unlawfully and maliciously wounded Sutcliffe with intent to cause him grievous bodily harm.
Jimmy was a professional criminal. He was, at that time, serving a sentence for armed robbery.
Mr. Sutcliffe was viciously attacked by Costello, who slashed him with a piece of broken glass.
And he managed to get a 5-inch scar going across the face, down the left eye and on the left eyelid.
I think the guy was probably just trying to score some brownie points in prison for attacking the Yorkshire Ripper, and of course I was upset he's my brother at the end of the day.
The attack gave the psychiatrist further ammunition. Sutcliffe was in clear danger from other prisoners. Once again, they asked for him to be moved to a mental hospital. This time, the Home Secretary agreed to a transfer to Broadmoor. The Ripper was now officially ill, although many felt that wasn't the real reason for the move.
I think he was removed for his physical protection. I think it was as simple as that. What they didn't want was him being murdered in prison, although perhaps a certain section of the public would have shed not a tear.
Broadmoor houses 500 of the most dangerous people in the country. Its most notorious inhabitant, the Yorkshire Ripper, took up residence in March 1984.
I saw the van arriving. It was a heavy Metropolitan Police escort, Thames Valley Police escort, and then, of course, within seconds, the word went round the hospital that Peter Sutcliffe had been transferred from Parkhurst Prison and was now a patient in Broadmoor.
I was glad he's gone to Broadmoor because it's a hospital and they might be able to do more for him. They've got psychiatrists and doctors there instead of being just like a prison. But it's a strange place, though, if you've ever got to visit it. It's not the nicest place in the world to be in, isn't Broadmoor?
But the doubters felt this was what Sutcliffe had wanted all along, a softer option than prison. But Sutcliffe continued to say he didn't belong in prison or hospital, and that he wasn't mad or bad. He was just obeying instructions from God.
I never saw any signs or symptoms of any mental illness. That's not to say he wasn't mentally ill. Psychiatrists, especially forensic psychiatrists, never claimed to be an exact science.
But others did see signs of mental problems. Keith Hellawell continued to visit Sutcliffe after his transfer to Broadmoor as part of the investigation into unsolved crimes he thought the Ripper might be responsible for.
Whilst talking about some of the horrific acts he committed, and he went into detail, he would actually then go off onto some other subject, talking almost about what was happening with the government in the same sentence as he was talking about what he did to one of his victims.
One of the features of schizophrenia is disorder where the person switches train of thought in a way that somebody who's observing them, talking to them, can't understand. It's sometimes called Knight's move thinking, because they go 2 steps forward and 1 to the side, and you can't work out where the 1 to the side came from.
On the surface, he appears to be quite normal. Clearly, he is not.
The Ripper played games with Hellawell for 11 long years. But in 1992, Sutcliffe, tired of the pretense, admitted there were other attacks he hadn't confessed to when he was arrested.
And out of the 10 probable crimes, I was focusing in on the top 2, the first 2. And the first 2 were attempted murders of young girls. And in the end, he confessed to them. The first one at the top of the list was a girl called Tracy Brown.
So Tracy Brown had been proved right. She was a victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. It was further evidence for the skeptics that the tale of voices from God and a mission to kill prostitutes was a lie.
She was a healthy, normal 14-year-old schoolgirl going about law-abiding business, and she wasn't in any red light district. She was in a rural area. And if you would have actually opened up the case with that one, I mean, God goes out the window and the voices go with him, don't they, really?
Despite the confession, no charges were brought.
This was a decision made by the Attorney General and the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, believing that as Sutcliffe was serving 20 life sentences, then what was the point in going through a court process to convict him of 2 more offences?
But Tracy wanted her day in court to bring the story to an end.
And I remember thinking, well, he's been sent down for all these murders, but what about mine? You know, where does that leave me? You know, I want justice done. I feel a bit cheated, really.
The confession was the end of an 11-year game. There were to be no more revelations, and Keith Hellawell wound his investigation down. So Sutcliffe turned his sights elsewhere.
Peter was highly manipulative. He took great delight and pleasure in trying to get one over on me or the staff in general. He always had this sort of wry smile playing about his lips. It's as if he knew something that I didn't or we didn't. He treated the whole place as a bit of a joke, really.
And it wasn't just the Broadmoor staff who Sutcliffe toyed with. He continued his mind games beyond the hospital walls, taking advantage of the public's enduring fascination with the Yorkshire Ripper. In 1993, poet Sandra Lester's life was falling apart after family breakdown and abuse. She was considering becoming a nun. And as an act of what she calls Christian kindness, she wrote to Sutcliffe.
I don't know why, or I didn't know why then, but I felt drawn to writing to him. I wanted a relationship at a distance that could be two-way supportive. It was a bad choice, it was a reckless choice, and I had no idea of the consequences.
Sutcliffe replied, and the exchange of letters quickly escalated, first into a daily routine, and then into a long-distance love affair.
I was very supportive and very sincere, and the relationship definitely deepened very, very quickly as a result of that, I believe. It was a very passionate, very intimate relationship on paper.
Dear Sandy, the moon in a jar is even better than moonbeams in a jar, as the song says. You can come up for a bite anytime, Sandy. And you can see my etchings too, by the way.
And yes, at the time I responded. I'm not saying that I didn't, I responded, and we did fall in love with one another.
With fondest thoughts, a great big caring cloud-9 hug, and lots of love, Pete.
He comes across not only totally human, but very warm, very well adjusted, very plausible, very kind, very understanding, humorous, intelligent, and I couldn't believe that this was a person that had done these things.
After 9 months, Sandra decided to move closer to Broadmoor. Sutcliffe and his wife had recently divorced, and now the Ripper began hinting he'd like to marry his devoted pen pal.
He was mentioning we might want to tie the knot. I said I would think about it, and we were working towards having visits, my interview for suitability to visit, and that was the next indispensable step to what long-term commitment we were going to make to one another.
The next stage was to win approval for a visit. For the first time, Sandra went inside Broadmoor's perimeter walls. She was interviewed by medical staff to assess her suitability and was disturbed by the line of questioning.
Did I like him writing to other women? I thought, well, this is a very strange question, you know. Oh, not particularly, no.
It finally dawned on Sandra that she wasn't the only woman in Peter Sutcliffe's life. He'd been fooling her and probably many others.
He would show me letters and photographs from young women, not the old women, but young women who wanted to save him, wanted to marry him, wanted to meet him, wanted to correspond with him. And in the early years, he had quite a substantial post bag, largely from women. He enjoyed that.
It keeps him going. He's constantly writing letters back and forth to people, but I just can't understand why any woman in the right mind would want to write to a mass murderer.
In fact, Sandra felt she'd been trapped by Sutcliffe's mind games at an extremely vulnerable time in her life.
I was horrified. You know, I'd moved my life and I'd made a commitment to this person, and I was going to be, probably if I stayed committed to it, one of God knows how many. I was shocked, really, really shocked, and actually quite frightened. Frightened at what I had done.
Sandra's application to visit Sutcliffe was rejected. She was told it was a joint decision by the Broadmoor authorities and the Ripper himself. She stopped writing to him and tried to put her life back on an even keel.
At the time, I was absolutely broken. It just goes to show how deeply involved I was and the impact that this person had on me and God knows how many other women. It really is quite frightening.
Sutcliffe continues to be a prolific letter writer and in fact gets more correspondence than any other patient in Broadmoor. Although he has many admirers outside the hospital, inside it's a different matter.
He kept himself aloof from the bulk of the patients. He didn't consider himself to be mentally ill for a start. which would have meant that he'd have viewed the other patients as people to be avoided, because ironically they could be dangerous, they could assault him or attack him.
He can never be certain if he goes to wash his hands in the toilet, walks down a corridor unaccompanied, that he's not going to be attacked. And that is a continuous hell, I would have thought, to live that way.
And in 1997, the fears became a brutal reality when a patient tried to murder him.
The attack took place in Broadmoor about 3 o'clock this afternoon, after Sutcliffe was involved in an argument with another patient.
What you're dealing with him is the fastest gun in the West syndrome there, so that anyone that stuck one on Sutcliffe was guaranteed at least national notoriety and probably international notoriety, and I'm sure he was a victim of his own success, Sutcliffe, in that respect.
The attack on Sutcliffe was staged by Ian Kay, a killer who was in Broadmoor after murdering a shop assistant.
There was sort of punches and so on that was going on. He was then stabbed in the eye with a pen. He'd been stabbed a number of times in both eyes. He'd lost the sight in one eye, and I understand that he'd lost visibility in the other eye. He was clearly shocked by what happened to him, rather than angry, I think. There was no outward show of anger, I would say.
Kay revealed the attack on Sutcliffe bore disturbing echoes of the Ripper's own crimes.
He told us that Sutcliffe had said that God had told him to murder the people he had murdered. Kay told us that he had been told by the devil to kill Sutcliffe.
Maybe it's a wonderfully ironic full circle there, that the fear that he imposed on innocent people in the north of England particularly for 5 years, he's known a bit of that fear with an attack that might come at any minute from an unsuspected quarter.
I don't think he blamed anyone, only the guy who did it. And he's obviously a psychopath anyway. He didn't try to shoulder the blame on Broadmoor. He just accepted it.
The attack was the start of a real change in Sutcliffe. The man who terrorised northern England is now virtually unrecognisable.
He's got diabetes and he's overweight and he's partially blind. He's deeply unhappy, yeah.
But is Peter Sutcliffe playing one final game? A game with the ultimate prize: freedom. Peter Sutcliffe has now been in Broadmoor Secure Hospital for more than 20 years and behind bars for almost 30, but he's far from forgotten.
I don't think the public will ever cease to lose its fascination with the 20th century Ripper, any more than they've lost their curiosity about the 19th century Ripper.
Every few months, another sensational newspaper story emerges on Peter Sutcliffe. And it's the debate on his sanity that lies at the heart of the enduring interest in the Yorkshire Ripper.
He hates the press. He doesn't like the press at all. They seem to drag something up week in, week out. They never mention that he's mentally ill and that's why he did it.
The psychiatrists believe that Sutcliffe shows classic signs of schizophrenia, such as hearing voices from God and the macabre difference between his gentle persona and his appalling crimes.
What was unusual, perhaps, about the Sutcliffe case, from what I've understood, and I've never interviewed him, is that his experiences were very compartmentalised. More than most, he seemed to be able to function in a reasonably normal way, despite having what seems to have been a serious underlying illness.
And within the last few years, after always professing he was sane, Sutcliffe has come to agree with the psychiatrists about his health.
He has got a mental illness, he'll admit that to you himself. He's on a lot of medication. Deep down there must be some demons lurking in his brain, some imbalance.
Many, though, believe he's been faking his illness. They cite the terrible nature of his violence and the sexual implications of the leggings he was wearing when arrested as evidence, allegations Sutcliffe continues to deny. Details of the leggings emerged in 2003 when Alan Foster revealed that after Sutcliffe's trial, he'd been told to destroy much of the remaining evidence.
As I was stood there throwing stuff into the furnace, I thought, this is wrong, it's very wrong. We're going to be inquiring into other murders and attempt murders, and we could be destroying a lot of evidence here.
Foster has given the leggings back to West Yorkshire Police for forensic analysis. He believes Sutcliffe may have committed many more crimes than the ones he's confessed to.
Justice has not been done. It's been partially done, but it's not been fully done. I would like Sutcliffe charged, get him back before a court, and make sure that there's definitely no chance of him ever getting out of Broadmoor or prison.
And there have been rumours that the Ripper is preparing a bid for freedom, to escape from a 26-year period of incarceration that has taken a severe toll on him.
He's obviously got older and I don't think he quite cares so much. He's got diabetes and he's overweight and he's partially blind. He seems quite depressed, I'd say. He's deeply unhappy, yeah.
The first step to freedom would be to prove his schizophrenia was under control. Then he could be transferred to a mainstream prison and be eligible for parole in 2011. But could the Yorkshire Ripper ever really be released?
I would have said at the time he was convicted that he's never going to come out. Now, with European rulings, with a different approach to this from, if I can call it, a higher authority, it's difficult to predict.
Ironically, though, if Sutcliffe has been faking mental illness by convincing psychiatrists he's schizophrenic, he's made release very unlikely.
Schizophrenia is a chronic illness. It requires continuous treatment. Where somebody has schizophrenia and has committed serial homicides, it draws you to the conclusion that it's pretty unlikely that the person will ever be in a state such that they would be safe to be released into the community.
His brother says Sutcliffe acknowledges this.
He's resigned to his life being in there. I'm his brother, but I think he should. I really don't think he should come out and it wouldn't be very fair on the victims' families for him to come out after doing all those horrible crimes.
One of those victims, Tracy Brown, agrees he should never be released. But surprisingly, she's writing to him, wants to visit him in Broadmoor.
It's just something that I've been thinking about for a while, that I would like to meet him. Just questions, why? What wrong have I done to you? What wrong have I done to anybody? And I was just an innocent person just walking home at the time. And I just want to see what his responses would be.
But that's the very thing Sandra Lester, the former Ripper pen friend, wants to stop. She believes Sutcliffe is ill but very manipulative and has written a book about her experiences in a bid to restrict his links with the outside world.
Somewhere along the line, something has gone drastically wrong. Somebody that murdered 13 women that we know of was given the right to have a harem of his own, a Lonely Hearts Club, to take advantage of vulnerable women. And I intend to get that system changed because he has swapped his hammer for a pen.
Only Peter Sutcliffe really knows if voices from God drove him to kill 13 women. So the debate will continue on what lies within the mind of this most notorious of killers.
Evil or not evil is not a medical question. The bottom line is that most offending by most mentally disordered people involves some sort of mixture of, I suppose in common sense terms, madness and badness. It's just that the ratio varies in different people.
I think he was mad. I think he was also exceptionally bad, perhaps uniquely so.
I was really angry for years with him over all this. I still am angry with him, but now I've come to realise a bit more that it was a mental illness that made him do these horrible things.
Much better to say nutter. Much better to say schizophrenic, psychotic. They are comfortable labels. The alternative is to consider that this man is evil, and that's much more frightening.
Serial killers such as Sutcliffe do appear on the surface to be quite rational, ordinary human beings. And that's the most chilling thought. It could be the next person you meet could be a Sutcliffe.
If you or someone you know has been affected by violent crime, contact Victim Support in confidence on 0845 30 30 900.